The rain pressed endlessly against the translucent sky dome, a steady percussion that had long ago become the rhythm of their lives. Thin streams rolled down the rib bark of the living tree that held their home aloft, dripping in silver lines, past the slats of the walkway outside. Inside, the one-room hut was thick with the steam of simmering root broth, its earthy scent clinging to damp air. Lyrian stirred it with slow, distracted motions, her hand moving more from habit than hunger. The silks she wore, once ceremonial, once meant to dazzle in parades, hung in tatters now, knotted roughly at one shoulder to keep them from sliding off entirely. They clung where they had once flowed, turning her into a figure of pity in the crowded markets. She had learned to lower her eyes when the whispers came, but the shame never stopped burning inside her dot. Her son sat cross-legged on a woven mat near the hearth. Kaler was thin for his 7 years, but his golden-flecked eyes were too alert for a child, always watching the world as if it might betray him. The seams of his tunic pinched across his shoulders, and he rubbed his arms for warmth, despite the thick humidity of the dome. He had learned silence early, but when his voice came at last, it carried the fear he couldn't bury. "Mom," he whispered, and for a moment it was so soft she thought she had imagined it. Then again, firmer, trembling. "Something grows on my back." The spoon slipped from her fingers and clattered against the clay bowl. She turned so sharply, her knee struck the floor with a jolt of pain, but she didn't notice it. She was already reaching for him, pulling at the fabric that clung to his shoulder. His tunic fell loose, and her breath caught in her throat. A pale shape clung to the base of his spine, no bigger than her palm, fused into his skin. Its translucent sac pulsed faintly, swelling with each rhythm of his blood. The sight hollowed her out in an instant. Her legs gave way, and she braced herself on the floor before she toppled entirely. Every story she had ever heard rose unbidden, choking her. The children marked like this never lasted long. By the time the shell hardened, the host weakened and burned with fever, then fell silent. No one survived it. She stared at the thing, the way its edges seemed rooted beneath his skin, and her throat closed around the scream, clawing to be released. Kaler's eyes were wide, filled with dread, but searching hers for something steady. He didn't cry, not yet. He needed her to hold still. She forced her trembling fingers to cup his cheek. "How long has it been there?" "Since this morning," he whispered. His voice broke on the words. "I thought it would go away." The ache of them pierced her deeper than any blade. She had fought every day to shield him from the cruelties of this place, scraping for food, stitching torn garments, smiling through humiliation. And here it was, the one thing she could not keep from him. "Does it hurt?" she asked, her voice raw. "Only when I move." He tried to straighten his back, then winced. "If I lie on my stomach, it doesn't press." "You won't lie like that anymore," she said quickly, too quickly. She swallowed hard, fighting to sound in control. If he sensed panic in her, it would crush him. He needed to believe she had a plan, even if she had none. Inside, terror clawed at her ribs. A market clinic would take him. Yes, but everyone knew what that meant. A draft, a curtain, and a body carried away before dawn. Priests would speak of destiny and cleansing, not survival. Neighbors would murmur pity, not help. Her eyes blurred with tears she could not let fall. She pressed her forehead to his, the both of them damp with sweat. Her voice came out steady, though her heart thundered. "You will live, Kaler. I won't let it take you." His small hand pressed against hers, hot, trembling, but trusting. He had nothing else to trust but her. She rose with unsteady legs, tying her silks tighter at the shoulder, forcing her body into motion before fear rooted her still. She ground dried leaves into paste, hands steadier with each motion, and pressed the cool salve around the parasite's edges. Not over the mouth, never that she remembered the fragments of warnings. His breath caught, then eased. "It's cooler," he murmured, his voice thin but relieved. She smoothed his hair back, her throat burning. "Good, stay quiet. Don't touch it." But already her mind was racing. She knew where she had to go, though shame made her hesitate even to think it. Not the priests, not the clinic, not the neighbors who watched but never helped. There was only one she could turn to: the human Garrick Valen, the exile who lived on the fringes, the man whose hands had once belonged to war. For years she had avoided him, too proud to admit need. But pride had no place here, not when the life of her son beat faintly beneath a parasite's skin. She looked back at Kaler, his face pale in the lantern's glow. "I will come back," she whispered. "Leave the lantern by me," he asked. Softly she lit it and placed it by his side. His golden eyes caught the flame, steady now, trusting her words. She touched his cheek once more, then turned to the door. The walkway swayed under her feet, slick with rain, but her steps were fast. Not reckless. Her mind rehearsed the words she would say, though none seemed strong enough. For the first time in years, she felt her world narrowing to a single vow. She would not let this parasite take her son, even if it meant surrendering the last shreds of pride she had clung to. She would find the human. She would beg if she had to dot, and as the rain hammered down on the dome above, Lyrian knew she had already crossed the point of no return. The rain had thickened into a gray curtain, drumming harder against the translucent sky dome as Lyrian hurried across the swaying bridges. The planks groaned underfoot, slick with algae, but she didn't slow. Her silks clung to her legs, heavy with water, dragging at her stride. Every step carried the image of Kaler's face, pale and trusting, and the faint, awful pulse of the parasite rising and falling against his skin. The settlement bustled even in the downpour traders, shouting prices beneath tarp awnings, children darting barefoot along the rails, priests in their green-stained robes moving through the crowds, with hands raised in blessings that had long since lost meaning. Lyrian kept her head low, her wet hair nodded back, her fists clenched around the cracked bowl of coins she had taken from its hiding place. She prayed silently that none of the priests stopped her, none of the neighbors called her name. If they did, she might falter. And faltering meant Kaler would die. She found his trail not in the market itself, but on the far edge, where the stalls thinned and the smell of boiled resin gave way to something sharper, cleaner. Garrick Valen's place was small, wedged, beneath the root arch of an ancient tree. Bundles of herbs hung in deep rows, tied with string, dripping with rain. Wooden crates were stacked carefully off the walkway. And there he was, the human. He stood with his back to her, lifting a heavy crate with the slow, precise strength of someone who never wasted motion. His shirt clung to his shoulders, soaked dark, and she could see the scars that mapped his forearms when he shifted. He turned at the sound of her steps, his gray eyes steady, assessing her face in a single glance, the strain in her breath, the knot of silk slipping from her shoulder, the bowl clutched too tightly in her hands. "My son," she said, the words, breaking free before she could compose them. "Something is on his back, a carapace. It fixed this morning, small but set." Garrick set the crate down and stepped closer, but not too close. His voice was low even, the kind that made you listen whether you wanted to or not. "Time since Latch?" She swallowed. "Hours. He can still walk. No fever." He nodded once. "Pain when he moves?" "Yes." "Any pressure applied?" "No." Another nod, the decision forming in his eyes as quickly as she spoke. "There is a window. First day is best. After that, removal risks bleed and toxin release. We do not wait for fever." Her throat tightened. The clinic would give him a draft and carry out the body, Garrick interrupted, his voice flat. He picked up a leather roll from a shelf and slung it under his arm. You chose right not to go. The words made her legs unsteady with relief, though she hated the weakness of it. He shifted his gaze toward the bridges. How far? 6. Bridges. 2 ladders. 1 rung is broken. I'll follow in case you slip. Go light. Steady pace. Start water boiling when you arrive. Do not let him roll onto it. He paused, rain dripping from his jaw, then added, Payment is later. We'll settle with work or trade. Her grip on the bowl of coins loosened. She could only nod, the words trapped behind her teeth. He didn't wait for thanks. He moved. The last crate aside, adjusted the roll at his side, and fell into step behind her as she turned back toward the heart of the settlement. He didn't speak, and she was glad of it. She had no strength for conversation, only for moving forward. When the wind gusted hard across a bridge, his hand brushed her elbow, just enough to steady her, never more than a second. On the ladder, when the broken rung came, he stood close, behind so that if her foot slipped, she would not fall. She did not slip. His silence was a shield, his presence a wall she hadn't known she needed, until it was their dot by the time they reached her door. Her silks clung like a second skin, her breath ragged. She pushed it open with shaking hands. Kaler lay as she had. Left him, curled on his side, the lantern glowing at his feet. His eyes fluttered open when he heard them. Too bright, too alert. He tried to sit up, but Lyrian's hand was already on his shoulder. Stay, she whispered. He's here to help. The boy's golden eyes turned to the human. Garrick lowered himself into the small space without ceremony, setting his leather roll neatly on the floor. He unbuckled it with practiced hands, laying out a narrow scalpel, a fine hook, clamps, thread sealed in glass, and a strip of dark cloth. Then he washed his hands with water from the pot, rubbed them with clear spirit, and warmed them briefly over the fire. My name is Garrick, he said, his voice steady but not unkind. I used to remove things like this in the field. I live here now. I grow plants and help when help is needed. We have a few steps. You will hear me count them. Your part is to stay still and keep your breath slow. Your mother will help you with that. Kaler's mouth trembled. Will I die? No, Garrick said without hesitation. We are on the good side of time. The sack is not full. I will move fast. It will hurt for a short while. Then it will be finished. Lyrian let his eyes across the fire, searching for hesitation, for weakness. She found none. Only the blunt certainty of a man who had seen too much and carried it. Anyway, she pressed her palms against the floor to steady herself, then moved to cradle her son's face between her hands. We breathe together, she whispered. 4. In, hold for out. Eyes on me. You do not look back. Kaler nodded faintly, his small fingers gripping hers. Garrick opened the bottle of numsap and let its sharp scent fill the room. Then we begin. The rain outside hammered harder, but within those walls the world shrank to firelight, steady hands, and the desperate hope of one mother refusing to let her child go. The lantern's glow painted the small hut in amber light, chasing shadows across the walls as Garrick lined his instruments on a folded cloth. The steady rain outside beat against the dome above, a constant drum that matched the thrum of Lyrian's pulse. She knelt at her son's head, her hands cupping Kaler's cheeks, forcing herself to breathe slow and steady so he would follow. Her led. He clung to her fingers as though they were the only solid thing left in the world. Garrick dipped the scalpel and hook into boiling water, counting quietly to himself, then lifted them out with clamps. He swabbed the parasite's edges with alcohol, careful not to touch the sack itself. The translucent swelling quivered faintly in response, as if alive to the intrusion. Kaler hissed through his teeth, the numb sap spreading cold fire across. His skin, it will dull the outer pain, Garrick explained in his calm, clipped way. Not the deep pressure. That will come. Stay still. Kaler nodded, though his lips trembled. Lyrian lowered her forehead to his, whispering the rhythm again. For in, hold, for out. She exaggerated each breath so he could match her. Parasite flexed once, its pulsing mouth tightening against the boy's spine. Garrick waited, eyes fixed, his body still as stone. When it relaxed, he moved with swift precision. One shallow cut to the left of the sack, another to the right. Blood welled bright, and he dabbed it away with boiled cloth, never hesitating. Kaler jerked at the sting, a small cry escaping before he bit it down. Lyrian whispered, "With me, my son, for in, hold, for out." His breath caught, then steadied. Against hers, Garrick's hook slid under the first incision, probing with the delicate patience of a man who had done this before in places far worse. The metal found the seam beneath the parasite's lip. He lifted, just a fraction. The mouth resisted, then gave with a faint, wet sound. Kaler's body stiffened. His eyes darted toward Lyrian, wide, searching for her face. She pressed her palms firmer against his skin. "Only me, Kaler. Eyes on me. Breathe with me." The tremor in his jaw eased. His grip on her hands tightened, but he did not turn away. "Good. Position," Garrick murmured, more to them than himself. He clamped the base of the sack with practiced care. "This will keep it from rupturing if it fights." As if hearing him, the parasite clenched suddenly, barbs locking against the boy's spine. Kaler gasped, his body arching. Garrick froze, his hands steady, waiting. Patience radiated from him, unshaken. "Do not force breath," he instructed. "Quietly. Hold until it releases." Lyrian counted softly with her son, their breaths shallow but aligned. The parasite's grip eased after an agonizing moment, its pulsing slackening. Garrick rotated his wrist a few degrees, testing the line of resistance. Another faint give, another wet snap as the lip lifted further. "Halfway. You are doing well," Garrick said, his tone firm, anchoring. Kaler's voice came in a strained whisper, one word. "Thirsty." "Wet cloth," Garrick said. "Never." Glancing up, Lyrian lifted the damp cloth and pressed it gently to her son's lips. He swallowed, blinked, then steadied again, clinging to her rhythm. Garrick narrowed his eyes, spotting a thin band of tissue still tethering the lower lip of the mouth to fascia. He snipped it with a swift, sure motion. The parasite recoiled, shuddered once, and went slack. Garrick felt the release through the hook dot with one clean motion. He lifted the entire sack free, the clamp fixed at its base. He moved swiftly, dropping it into a waiting bowl of alcohol. The parasite hit the liquid, whitened instantly, and stilled. 4. A long breath. The room was silent, but for the rain. Kaler trembled, his lips parting in a sound that was almost a sob, almost a laugh. Lyrian pressed her forehead to his, her own breath shaking but controlled. Garrick pressed a boiled cloth to the wound, firm and steady. He packed it with resin that smelled of pine and smoke, then sealed the skin with 2 quick, neat stitches. Finally, he wrapped a clean bandage around the torso, snug but not constricting. "It is out," he said at last, his voice carrying the weight of certainty. "No rupture, no seeded barbs. You called me in time." Kaler sagged into his mother's arms, exhausted but alive. His small body was hot with effort, his breath uneven but steady. Lyrian kissed his temple, her tears finally spilling, though. Silently, so he would not see them. "You will live, my son," she whispered. "You will live." Garrick began cleaning his tools with the same quiet precision, placing each one back in its place on the cloth. His hands were still, his expression unreadable. Only the faint tightening of his jaw betrayed the strain of the last hour. But when his eyes lifted, gray and unwavering, Lyrian felt something shift in the room. This man had not come to judge, or to pity, or to profit. He had come because she called. And against the rain's relentless drum, he had kept his word. By dawn, the storm softened, the relentless hammer of rain easing to a soft patter against the dome above. Pale light filtered the living wood, painting the hut in a muted glow. Lyrian had not closed her eyes once. She sat propped against the wall, her son stretched across her lap, his breathing even and warm, the rise and fall of his chest a miracle she still couldn't quite believe. The bandage at his spine held firm, the resin sealing neat and strong, and no fever burned his skin. Her fingers stroked his hair in absent circles, as if by touch alone she could anchor him to life. The bowl that held the dead parasite lay emptied now, its contents thrown out before morning. She hadn't wanted the neighbors to see, to ask questions, to whisper, but already the whispers had started. She'd heard them on the walkways when she went for water, the human's name on tongues that rarely spoke his without suspicion. A knock came at the doorframe, low, deliberate. Lyrian stiffened, her first instinct protective. She eased Kaler onto the mat and slid the latch open. Garrick stood outside, shoulders damp from mist, a bundle of clean moss and string under one arm. He entered without ceremony, setting the supplies on the floor. His presence filled the small space without noise, his movements as precise as the night before. Kaler blinked awake, his golden eyes brightening at the sight of him. "You came back," he whispered. "I said I would," Garrick replied simply, crouching by the boy to check his pulse at the wrist. "How do you feel?" "It itches. That means it's healing." Garrick unwound the bandage with steady hands, inspected the stitches. No swelling, no seepage, clean work. He applied fresh resin, wrapped a new bandage, and tied it off. With string. The boy hissed once at the sting, but didn't flinch. Lyrian saw how he watched Garrick, how he catalogued every motion with solemn eyes. She found herself speaking without planning it. "Why did you leave your people's army?" For a moment he was silent, the cloth taut between his hands. Then he said, evenly, "Too many years of cutting men open to keep them fighting. I grew tired of stitching them so they could die. The next week, I left not for peace, but for silence." His words landed heavy, plain as stones dropped into water. Lyrian studied him, realizing that his quiet exile among herbs wasn't retreat, but choice, a life carved deliberately away from death, though it still clung to him in scars and discipline. Kaler tilted his head with childlike bluntness. You miss them? The soldiers?" "No." Garrick finished the knot and met his eyes. "But I miss knowing every cut I made had a reason. Here, I don't always know, but you're still here today. That's enough." Lyrian's chest tightened. At the honesty in his tone, no pretense, no speeches, just truth, unvarnished. She fetched water, her silks slipping at the shoulder. Garrick's eyes flicked briefly toward the fabric, not with hunger, not with judgment, only acknowledgement. That unsettled her more than stares ever had. They shared root cakes in silence, Kaler chewing slowly, savoring each bite. For the first time in years, a meal passed without tension, without fear that the door might open to collectors or priests. Lyrian almost let her shoulders relax. Almost. But when she ventured to the market later, whispers followed her steps. The human is there again. She lets him in even at night. What kind of woman allows that? The words lodged in her chest like thorns. She told herself she didn't care, but her steps grew faster, all the same. By evening, Garrick was back with herbs and salves. Kaler greeted him with open trust, and when the boy finally slept, the two adults sat by the low fire. The silence between them was different now, not heavy but charged, filled with things unsaid. "They're talking," Lyrian said at last, her voice sharper than intended. "About you. About us." "I know," Garrick answered, calm as stone. "Markets always talk. It's different. They'll say I let you in because I'm weak. Because I'll cling to anyone who offers help." His gray eyes found hers, steady, unflinching. "Do you believe that?" Heat climbed her throat. She wanted to deny it, to push the words away, but instead she whispered, "No, but I don't." "Know what you want." For the first time, his voice faltered, dropping low. "I'm here because your boy needed me. I stayed because I wanted to." The fire crackled. Rain tapped steady on the dome. Her hands trembled against the cloth she pretended to fold. His scarred fingers rested near hers, close enough for her to feel the warmth. Not touching, but almost. "You don't have to be afraid of me," he said quietly. Her breath caught. She wanted to lean into that warmth, to believe it, but fear was a chain she wasn't ready to break. She forced herself to stand, muttering, "I should sleep." He nodded, gathering his tools, but his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have before he stepped into the mist. Lyrian stood in the doorway long after he had gone, the whispers of her neighbors heavy in her ears. But inside, her son slept alive, and for the first time in years, the weight of her burdens felt shared. The days that followed built themselves into a rhythm Lyrian had not known for years. Each morning Garrick returned, sometimes with bundles of moss, sometimes with food wrapped in cloth, always with his leather roll of tools kept dry despite the endless rain. He checked the stitches, replaced the resin, answered every question Kaler asked in his blunt, steady way. The boy grew stronger. With startling speed, his voice brighter, his laughter returning in bursts that startled Lyrian almost as much as the parasite had. For so long she had lived in silence that the sound of her son laughing felt almost foreign, like a memory restored. But the settlement was not blind. By the fourth day, the whispers were no longer hushed. On the bridges, as she passed with her water jugs, voices rose just enough to carry the human again. She lets him inside every day. At night, too. What kind of woman allows that? Eyes slid away when she looked back, but the weight of them pressed hard against her skin. She carried her head high, but inside, the old shame stirred like an old wound reopened. That evening, after Garrick had checked the wound and replaced the bandage, Kaler spoke with the plain certainty of children. "Why don't you eat here?" "Every night?" Lyrian froze, the question landing like a stone in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but Garrick answered before she could, "Because your mother hasn't asked me to." The boy turned his golden eyes on her, expectant. "Then ask him." Her throat tightened. She felt Garrick's gaze on her, steady, waiting. Pride warred with need, fear with gratitude, but in the end she heard herself whisper, "If you want to stay, you can." "I'll stay," he said simply, and his gaze lingered on her a fraction longer than before. That night they ate together, by the fire. The broth was thin, stretched with herbs Garrick had brought, but it felt like a feast. Kaler chattered between bites, telling some half-remembered story of a neighbor's boy who had fallen through a ladder rung. His hands waved in excitement, his laughter spilling into the room like sunlight breaking through cloud. He leaned against Garrick without hesitation, as though the human had always been there. Garrick, steady as stone, allowed it, his expression unreadable, but softer somehow, in the FIREHT dot, and Lyrian felt something twist in her chest relief. Gratitude, but also a dangerous pull she dared not name. It was on the sixth day that the settlement forced the issue. She returned from the market to find a crowd gathered near the water stairs. priests in their green-stained robes at the center. Their voices carried over the rain. This woman allows an outsider into her home. She lets him sit by her fire, touch her child. She would choose corruption over cleansing. Is this the example our children should see? Eyes turned toward her as she froze on the walkway, water jugs heavy in her hands. The whispers she had ignored were now sharpened into accusations. She felt the heat rise to her face, the old shame clawing again. But then she thought of her son's laughter, of Garrick's steady hands pulling death from his spine, of the truth she had lived. She stepped forward, setting the jugs down with deliberate care. Her voice, when it came, was stronger than she expected. "He lives because of him," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd. "No priest saved my son. No clinic gave him breath. You would have let him die behind a curtain. He is alive because the human removed what you called destiny." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some faces turned away. Others stiffened in outrage. But Garrick, who had come up quietly behind her, did not move, did not speak. He simply stood, gray eyes calm, letting her words carry. For the first time in years, Lyrian felt her voice cut through the whispers. She had spoken not with shame, but with defiance. And though fear still churned in her stomach, something else stirred alongside it: pride, hard and unyielding. That night, in the small hut, Garrick sat quietly by the fire while Kaler drifted to sleep between them. Lyrian adjusted the shawl, slipping from her shoulder, her hands unsteady. The weight of what she had said in public still echoed inside her. She had chosen him, chosen truth over silence. You didn't have to. "Defend me," Garrick said at last, his voice low. "Yes," she replied, meeting his eyes across the glow. "I did." He nodded once, no smile, no boast. But in the silence that followed, something settled between them, heavier and more certain than any vow dot. She had risked her standing, her pride, her safety. And she would do it again. The rain had eased to a fine mist, silvering the air under the dome. But inside the hut, the fire burned low, filling the room with the scent of resin and damp wood. Kaler slept on his mat, curled against the cushions, his breath deep and even. Lyrian sat across from Garrick, her silks clinging damply at the shoulders, needle and thread idle in her hands. She pretended to mend, but her fingers moved without purpose. Her eyes kept straying to him. He sat with his back against the wall, arms braced on his knees, his leather roll closed at his side. In the flicker of firelight, the scars along his forearms stood out, thin lines, jagged ridges, the history of a life carved in flesh. He had saved her son without hesitation, stayed without demand, endured the whispers of the market without flinching. And yet she knew almost nothing about the man. Nothing but fragments passed in rumor. A soldier, a deserter, an exile who chose herbs and silence over war. "Why here?" she asked at last, her voice quiet but sharp in the hush. "You could have lived apart, away from our bridges, our eyes. Why answer when I called?" He didn't answer immediately. His gaze lingered on the fire, gray eyes steady but distant. Finally he said, "Because no one else did." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any speech. Still, it wasn't enough. She pressed further, words tumbling out before fear could choke them back. "You fight like a soldier. You cut like a surgeon. Men like you don't just walk away. Not unless something broke." His jaw tightened, and for the first time, she saw hesitation, a shadow in the stillness he wore like armor. He shifted, rubbed a scar at his wrist as though it itched. Then he spoke, each word measured, clipped. "I left because I was ordered to stop saving children." Lyrian's breath caught. "What?" "On the frontier," he said, eyes still, fixed on the fire, Supplies were scarce. Wounded came by the dozen. Orders were clear treat, only those who could fight again. The rest were waste, the children. He exhaled through his nose, a sound sharp as steel on stone. We were told to ease them. Quicker that way, they said. Cleaner, I refused. The silence pressed heavy around them, broken only by the soft patter of mist on the dome. Lyrian's throat tightened. She imagined him then, surrounded by bodies, by the screams of the wounded, the cold commands of officers. She saw him choosing defiance, knowing it meant exile. You deserted, she said. His eyes flicked to hers at last, unflinching. I deserted. Her heart pounded. She should have felt fear. A deserter in her home, at her fire, at her son's side. But instead, what rose in her chest was something else: confusion, anger at his commanders, a sharper, more dangerous pull of trust. Kaler stirred on the mat, half awake. His small voice broke the silence, thin but certain. If refusing to let children die is wrong, then I want you to stay wrong forever. The words hit Lyrian like a blow. She turned to her son, his golden-flecked eyes heavy with sleep, but fierce with conviction. Garrick's expression softened for the first time. Just a flicker at the edge of his mouth, quickly gone. Lyrian's hands trembled in her lap. She had spent years enduring whispers, carrying shame, burying her voice. And here was her son, speaking truth with the blunt force of innocence. She looked back at Garrick, the man who had cut death from her child's back with steady hands, the man who carried a past soaked in blood, but refused to let it define his future. The fire popped, throwing sparks. Garrick shifted, leaning forward, his arms braced on his knees. His voice was low, steady, but it carried weight that filled the small room. I don't ask forgiveness for leaving. I don't regret it. If that makes me guilty, then so be it. I won't stand by while the weak are left to die. Not then. Not now. Lyrian swallowed hard, her chest tight, her silks damp where her hands clenched them. She had asked for truth, and he had given it, raw and unvarnished. She should have been afraid. Instead, she felt the dangerous stir of something she had long buried: respect, trust, and the first fragile spark of hope. Kaler yawned and curled tighter, already drifting back into sleep. The firelight softened across his face, peaceful now. Lyrian looked at Garrick, at the scars and the silence, and the blunt honesty. For the first time, she realized that the whispers of the settlement, the priests, the clinics, none of them had ever mattered. What mattered was here, in this room, in this fragile, steady quiet. And she knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that she did not want him to leave. The morning of the 8th day dawned with a restless tension under the sky dome. The mist had cleared, leaving the walkways slick and gleaming like wet glass. Traders raised their voices sharper than usual. Children were hushed indoors, and the priests gathered in a cluster near the water stairs, their green-stained robes gleaming with damp. Word had spread too fast, moving faster than rain. The woman whose son had survived the parasite. The human who had done what no clinic, no priest, no neighbor had dared. Lyrian felt the eyes on her long before the knock came. She had braced herself for whispers. She had not braced herself for the crowd. When the priests and their guards arrived at her door, Kaler still sat by the fire, upright but pale, his bandage neat beneath his tunic. Garrick rose from where he crouched, his leather roll half open on the floor, his gray eyes narrowing. You will present the boy, the lead priest said. His voice was smooth, almost kind, but the steel beneath it cut like a blade. We have heard claims. The people require proof. If he lives, we must see if corruption lingers. The dome does not. Suffer what is unclean. Lyrian's throat tightened. She had defied them once, in words. Now they had come to strip her silence by force. She looked at Garrick. He gave no signal, only the barest nod, as if to say, "You already know your answer." She turned to her son. His golden eyes were wide, uncertain, but steady. "Show them," she whispered. Kaler's small hands fumbled with the ties of his tunic. The fabric slipped from his shoulders, bearing the thin line of stitches at the base of his spine. Gasps rippled through the doorway. The wound was clean, the resin sealing like amber, the skin around it pink but whole. Alive, healed Doc, but then the murmurs grew louder. Because from beneath the stitches, faint lines spread outward, veins translucent, glowing softly with the rainlight that filtered through the dome. They traced like roots across his back, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Not infection. Not decay. Something new. The priests recoiled as if struck. One hissed a curse under his breath. Another raised a hand toward the boy, fingers trembling. "It lingers," he whispered. "The parasite seed. The child is marked." "No," Garrick said, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. He stepped forward, placing himself between Kaler and the priests. Not seed. Not sickness. Implantation. The word froze the room. Lyrian stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "What do you mean?" His eyes flicked to her, steady but grim. This species was never just parasite. It was hostmaker. They've never seen one survive the first stage. But he has. And now it grows in him, not against him. Kaler shifted, his face pale. "Am I dying?" Garrick crouched, his scarred hands firm on the boy's shoulders. "No, not dying. Changing. You feel it, don't you?" "Stronger under the skin." The boy nodded, frightened but not broken. His mother's hand slipped into his. Trembling, clutching, the priests muttered among themselves, their fear turning sharp. "Abomination," one hissed. "It must be cleansed. Burned before it spreads." Lyrian's heart stopped. She saw the guards' hands tighten on their staves, saw the crowd's faces waver between awe and revulsion. She heard her son's breath quicken, felt his small fingers clutch hers in terror. And in that moment, with the dome echoing with judgment, she chose. She stepped forward, shoulders squared, voice ringing louder than it ever had. "No one touches." "Him," the priests gaped. Garrick rose to his full height beside her, silent but unyielding, the weight of his presence turning the air heavy. "He lives," Lyrian said, her voice carrying over the rain. "And he will keep living. If the dome cannot suffer that, then it does not deserve him." The words shocked even her as they left her mouth. She had spoken them not as plea, but as decree. The priests faltered. The crowd shifted uneasily. Garrick's hand brushed her elbow, grounding her, steadying her. And in the space of that heartbeat, she realized the truth she had already known. There would be no return to silence, no retreat to shame. Her son bore something the world had never seen. And she and Garrick were the only shield he had. Outside, the rain began again, harder, drumming against the dome like a warning.